Welcome all to the March 2011 Broadband Breakfast Club. The Broadband Breakfast Club is a program of broadbandbreakfast.com, a news and events organization building community around internet policy and intellectual property. We are very pleased this morning to have an exciting program entitled the National Broadband Plan, a one-year update. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to first thank our sponsors. The sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club are the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, the Telecommunications Industry Association, and U.S. Telecom. Please join me in thanking the sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club. And one more thing, you'll see a survey on your table. If you need extras, let me know. If you could please fill it out before you leave. We very much value your input on our events. And finally, I want to introduce our moderator, Drew Clark. Drew Clark is an experienced independent telecom industry observer and brings a unique public interest perspective to broadband data collection and research. In February 2010, he became executive director of the Partnership for a Connected Illinois, a nonprofit organization with the goal of ensuring that all Illinoisans have access to high-quality broadband and that broadband is being well used by the people of the state. As the state's designated entity to perform broadband research, planning, data, and outreach, the Partnership for a Connected Illinois has received funding from the NTIA's State Broadband Data and Development Grant Program, as well as the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Drew founded the news and data company BroadbandCensus.com, which is the parent company of BroadbandBreakfast.com. Please join me in welcoming Drew Clark.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I'm really delighted to be back here at the Broadband Breakfast Club. As most of you know, I founded BroadbandBreakfast.com and BroadbandCensus.com some years back, and many of you have been aware of and friends of ours and involved in various of our programs, conferences in the past. But as Sylvie just mentioned, in February of last year, 13 months ago, I took a full-time position in Illinois, and I'm pleased to be able to come back and moderate for the first time the Breakfast Club, the Broadband Breakfast Club since then. And hopefully I'll be able to, in my question and our discussion, discuss a little bit about what we're doing in Illinois at the Partnership for Connected Illinois. But before we kind of engage on that topic, I wanted to really bring our panelists into this picture. We have a very dynamic group of panelists who've been involved in this issue for years and years. And this document that was released a year ago tomorrow over at the FCC is really the fruit of many years of work by a lot of individuals here at this table. And so I'm hoping that their expertise can really inform this discussion along with the interchange with all of you. So to my left is Jim Baller, who's the president of the Baller-Herbst Law Group. And Jim has been leading the charge for a national broadband plan for longer than anyone else I know. Maybe there's someone else, but I don't know of that person. And Jim founded the U.S. Broadband Coalition in early 2008, and I was very privileged to be involved with the organization. But Jim is a lawyer representing a variety of organizations and communications entities that want to ensure broadband, and I'm sure he'll tell us more about how he came to feel so passionate about this. Then we have Robert Atkinson, or Rob Atkinson, and he's the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and ITAF has really been at the leading edge of so many technology policy discussions, very versatile organization. And what it does, Rob, I was particularly happy we could get him, because he's so busy, to be at our program, because he has really been a key advocate of the benefits, the network externalities, if you will, of broadband. And Rob, I hope, will be able to speak about this. He's also got an event of his own tomorrow on the National Broadband Plan, so we're very happy he could be here with us today. Next is Eric Garr. Eric is an Illinoisan who's here in Washington. I'm a Washingtonian in Illinois. And Eric is the principal at Diamond Advisory Services, where he serves clients in telecommunications, financial services, and government services. But he really was kind of the COO, if you will, of the National Broadband Plan. So we have him to thank for this document, I understand. And I hope he'll tell us a little bit about the sausage-making process over a few blocks away from here. We have last-minute addition to our panel, Clyde Edwards. Clyde is the National Director of Community Impact for One Economy, and he's been there 8 of the last 10 years. And previously, he worked as a staffer for Elizabeth Furr and Diane DeGette in Congress on these issues. And he is responsible for the community engagement efforts of One Economy, which is a very well-known nonprofit based here in Washington and recipient of some of the broadband stimulus awards in the sustainable broadband, perhaps other programs. And we'll look forward to hearing more about that and how One Economy is viewing the National Broadband Plan. Daniel Bereninger is an independent communications architect and analyst. He's been very involved with voice over internet protocol for many years, and really is probably the most equipped propeller head on this panel in terms of engineering knowledge. And we'll hear some of his comments on the National Broadband Plan and some of its technical recommendations, or how it is succeeding or failing. And then last but not least, we have Keith Montgomery, who's Senior Program Director for Broadband at ICF International, and has been very involved in New Zealand's broadband initiatives, and also working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture on the broadband infrastructure program. So we have, again, a great panel here, and I thought I would lead off our discussion by highlighting this document. So this is not my first copy of the National Broadband Plan. The first one I got a year ago at the FCC, and I took it back to Illinois, and Pat Quinn, the governor, promptly took it from me. And you know, that's bad news because I didn't have one for a little while, but it's good news in that it shows how attuned the governor of Illinois is to these issues. But I went and got another one, and this one came from John, or from Eric, John Eric Garr, who brought it to an event that we spoke together about. And what I just really want to highlight is the 3 parts of the National Broadband Plan. It begins with innovation and investment, talking about the landscape, the ecosystem for broadband, and how it works and how it can be improved. And then perhaps what is the heart of it in some ways, first heart, is inclusion, which is both about availability and about adoption and utilization, how we can ensure lines and towers get and reach everyone, but also that people well use broadband. But then there's finally this last part, national purposes, which is how broadband impacts healthcare, education, energy and the environment, economic opportunity, government performance, civic engagement, public safety. And this is really probably the greatest contribution in my mind, the second heart, if you will, to the plan, in that it talks about what broadband really does for the economy. So let me ask Jim, when you started thinking that there needed to be a national broadband plan, is this the kind of structure you were thinking? What were you thinking?
Well, first of all, Drew, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate here today, and thanks to all of you for being here, especially those of you who have been working these issues very hard over the course of the last few years. My background influenced how I viewed these issues. My main client base are the communities that went through this a century ago, when electricity was the must-have technology of the day, and the private sector could not electrify all of the country fast enough to satisfy demand. Some 3,000 of those communities stepped forward, recognizing the importance of electricity as a platform for growth and development and economic vitality. and form their own electric utilities. Many of them saw telecommunications as being the same thing for this century. And so when I got started in calling for a national broadband policy or strategy back in 2004, it seemed to me that we had a tremendous opportunity in front of us if we could get the public and private sectors pulling in the same direction. At the time, we had no reliable data on broadband availability, adoption, or use. We had no consensus on what kind of data was necessary and what was useful. We had a sense that we were not doing as well as some of the leading countries, particularly Asian countries, all of which had national broadband plans. And it seemed to me that whatever perspective you had, be it conservative, liberal, whatever, we had a strong mutual interest in coming together, outlining a framework that would help guide the decision-making so that we could have a policy that was comprehensive, that was amenable to dialogue, but a structured dialogue with some framework, so we weren't just making ad hoc decisions. It took a long time. It took the work of a great many of us, including several on this panel, to accept the principle that we needed a plan. We finally did, through our coalition, bring some of the best minds to bear. We did come up with a framework that made sense, and now here we are with a national plan. It's a very elegant, comprehensive document formed through an open process that took the views of all sectors of the economy into account. As you read it page to page, some of it is just brilliantly written and thought through. I give Eric and his team a great deal of credit for that. And now we have a baseline on which to build. Is it a perfect plan? I think few of us would say that we agree with all of its parts. Some of us would disagree vehemently with some of its parts, but we have this. We have it to build on. And I think most important to me of all through this entire process is that through a combination of the work on the stimulus, the National Broadband Plan, the Google initiative, and other things that have happened, we have progressed as a country perhaps 5 years in the last 2. We now have thousands of companies and tens of millions, if not more, Americans who can now speak broadband in the vernacular as opposed to Latin. We have now got a country that's thinking about the opportunity of broadband, about the challenges that it poses, and I think if all this continues to occur the way it has over the last couple of years, we'll advance another 5 years in the next 2, and that's great for our country.
I'm going to hold my question about whether it's too timid because I want to get more of our speakers here. Okay, you answered it. Rob, what's your take on this, on broadband and its importance historically and this plan that's come out in the last year?
Well, like Jim, I want to thank you for having me and appreciate the opportunity to talk today. For those of you broadband policy wonks like me who just think, you don't have a day of an event that it's a bad day, we do have a fix for you tomorrow. We have an event at 9:30 where we're reassembling. I feel like the movie Blues Brothers. We're bringing back the gang. We're bringing back the band. Blair and his team from the National Purposes Group is going to be presenting tomorrow, so it's on our website. Drew, when we were talking earlier, mentioned that he was at a meeting in Chicago where they alluded to a comparison between broadband and swimming pools. essentially to say that broadband is a sort of a luxury good, that why is there a national effort to promote it when it's just really this thing that maybe elites use to surf the web and find some entertainment. And it's amazing to me that somebody could still say that, particularly that's not a right-wing ideological think tank. It's to me beyond belief that anybody in today's environment could see broadband as not a critical thing that you just have to have. Maybe it's not as important as electricity, because if you don't have electricity, you can't have broadband, but it's pretty darn important. And I think one of the main things I would argue, and I guess go to the plan. I mean, I think the plan's one of the best things the federal government's done in 20 years in terms of an analytical effort, a strategic effort. It was a great group of folks that Blair brought together, and they did a wonderful, wonderful job. And yeah, like everybody else, I don't agree with everything in the plan. That's the caveat. But it's very, very good. I guess the one thing I think the plan could have done more on is put some resources behind it. And I know there's this big thing about the budget deficit and all that. But at the end of the day, you have to put some resources behind this. It can't just be a lot of kind of helping the private sector and the nonprofit sector align and all that. There's got to be some resource behind it. And the second thing is, I think we could have, to me, the major thing in broadband, and no offense meant to people who are trying to work on the supply side, building the networks. I think the major thing is the adoption issue. And I think the plan could have been more aggressive on the adoption issue than it was. If you read Goal 3 of the plan, which is every American should have affordable access to robust broadband service and the means and skills to subscribe if they choose. And I know why the plan did that, because if they said something like, we expect to see a X percentage point increase in broadband adoption every year for the next 15 years with the ultimate goal that 94% of Americans will be subscribing by X year, they would be accused of all sorts of socialist and other types of, dictatorial plans to force Americans to, where's your broadband? And if you don't have it, we're going to give you a fine, which actually some people have said. But still in all, I think that should be the goal. We need to belly up to the bar and say, how are we going to get people who aren't subscribing now to subscribe? And, obviously we don't want to force people and all that stuff, but there are lots and lots of reasons. We know why people don't subscribe. And I think we need to have a much more serious policy discussion about what we're going to do, because and my last point, Drew, you talked about network effects or network externalities and why when someone else subscribes it benefits everybody, including me. To me, this is one of the main things. If we could get up to universal penetration, then a whole lot of things can go away. Paper, for example, in-person services. I mean, once you can get pretty much everybody doing this, you don't have to have 2 or 3 legacy channels by which you reach customers, whether those are citizen customers from the governments or whether they're just private sector customers from the private sector. And that would drive productivity and innovation in a significant way. So I really think that at the end of the day, we've really got to put more effort there.
Thanks, Rob. Great summary. So, Eric, we want to really give you a chance to talk about what it was like on the inside. I'm particularly interested in how you decided to balance the, quote, supply issues with the, quote, demand issue, which Rob's just referred to, and the way you framed the 3 major sections.
Sure. First, again, thanks for having me here. A year ago at this time, I hadn't slept since Thanksgiving. Nor had I shaved, those of you that remember seeing me at that time. This was the most difficult thing I've ever been asked to do. And when Julius and Blair talked me into it, in hindsight, maybe I should have taken a pass. I would have been much more rested and all the rest of it. That said, I'm very proud of it. And it was really a great experience to have the chance to lead such a remarkable team of people and interact with such a remarkable group of people in this community that care about these issues. The tricky part is sort of how do you do something like this? And you have to answer that question before you can decide whether you want more about supply or more about demand or more about fiber or more about 4G or whatever. And you could have done this a lot of ways. You could have said, all right, a couple of us are just going to sit in a room and we think we're pretty smart and we'll put some things up on a whiteboard and write a plan. And you could have done it that way. We chose the extreme opposite of that, which was to make this as wide open as possible with as much opportunity for public comment. So you know, when you look at the plan, remember that it's really kind of two things in there. At one level, it's a reflection of the ideas in America on these topics, because those are really the primary inputs for this. And then it also is a reflection of some judgments that our team had to make, because that was our job. And that judgment was trying to balance a situation where you didn't have all the data you wanted. And, you know, if you're going to make my rule of thumb always is if you're going to start talking about intervening in markets, you better have your data sorted out. It's a dangerous thing to do, and it's very easy to, you know, goof up. So you had to balance on one side kind of not having the data that you'd want, but then making sure you got what data you could and did your best with it. And then balancing on the other side a plan that needed to have an aspiration for the country. And we needed to kind of have a North Star a little bit in terms of where, you know, where we need to go and where we want to go. So that turns you into making lots of decisions about supply and demand and structure, et cetera. And, you know, the structure of the plan, I think, mirrors to me, and it's funny, if you knew the other different structures that were before this one, it's actually something that's kind of interesting. Someday I'll kind of gather all those up and look at them again. It took us a while to actually get it all in one spot. And what we kept coming back to was there really are, I think, three dynamics that are occurring in the market. And that was always our guiding principle. The plan wasn't about what was going on in the FCC. The plan was what was going on about what was going on out in the world. And so the structure had to mirror the issues going out in the world. And if you kind of fly above all the information in this industry, there's sort of three dynamics occurring. One is a private market dynamic that actually over the last year I think has been going great. I mean, I think if you look at the DOCSIS 3 rollout and the 4G rollout and sort of all sorts of good stuff, and you look at earnings releases from companies, customers are buying and people are adopting, great. So that needs to move, and government has a role there. But you can't just do that. You know, you got to recognize that there's another dynamic, which is to say that certain parts of America are being left out. And so what can you do to use the appropriate public actions that you have at your disposal to work on that dynamic and try to improve it? And then the third one, and I'll be at Rob's event tomorrow, I think it's a great topic for an event, is that, you know, there are application areas where we wish we had better apps. You know, we wish we had better healthcare apps. We wish we had better apps around education, and that we as communications people can get really excited about the network, but we got to not lose sight of the fact that most of the value to the economy is actually from an application. You know, if you think about what's the portion of the GDP tied up in networks, you know, it's not a small number, but you're talking a few percent. You're not talking about, you know, 50% of the economy is in our telco networks. However, if you think about how much of the economy is wrapped up in healthcare, education, some of the other areas of national purposes, that's where the value to America comes. And that's the other dynamic that we wanted to address, is that a lot of other countries' broadband plans are really just about the network. And not that the network's not important, but if you don't get the applications right, you know, I mean, I'll be thrilled because I think networks are really cool and it'd be a lot of fun, but until you have the applications that are broadly adopted, you haven't really moved the needle on the economy. So that's where the structure came from, and it really was about what we thought was going on outside the building and how would the plan kind of fit into the world that it was going to come into.
Eric, let me ask you, when you were putting this together, you and the team there, Blair Levin and everyone, where did you want this to be at a year later, 5 years later? What was your sense of how the progress would be tracked over time?
Yeah, you know, we gave a lot of thought about that, and Jim's comments hit home because we very much viewed this as a baseline. You know, we didn't have a plan. So, you know, so imagine somebody says, sit down, write a plan. It'd be nice to know what, like, the last plan was and how did we do. And, you know, you didn't have any of that. You had to just kind of start from scratch. So there was a very strong commitment on our part to say our first job was to build a fact base for the country. That was job one. And if we did a good job of that, good things would happen outside the building. You know, companies would make decisions, communities would make decisions, people would make decisions, and that's kind of how all this stuff works. It's really all about others and the choices that they make. And then once we got that down, then we did want to try and push the ball forward on the issues where we felt we could make a case. But I think that the team, the way Blair and the chairman and myself and others directed the team was very clear: get the fact base down. If we fail at that, we failed. The country's going to expect at least that. And then if the foundation's strong enough, the plan's going to live on well. And we're going to change our mind about stuff. And I'll be the first one to say the plan is far from perfect. There are things that, knowing what I know now after a year away from it, there are parts I would change. There are parts I would think differently about. And everybody should feel that way.
What would you change?
In a second. Everybody should feel that way. And if we ever start thinking that this is some sort of chiseled tablet that we just need to follow, I mean, that's just not how we do things here. And in this country, it's more about people making decisions and choosing to invest the capital in different places.
Didn't you go to Mount Sinai to bring this?
Yeah, right. No. It's so I think that's so I think it's living very well, and I think our aspiration when we delivered it was, would it create the right debate, and would it create the environment for people to make decisions and move forward? And then the good ideas are going to live on, and the lousy ideas are going to fall away, and that's fine. And in a few years, whenever the time is right, the country should take another look. And at least the next time we take a look, we'll have that fact base, and we'll have a way to say, boy, that idea they put in there on page 148 was silly. And that's okay. And we're not going to do that. We're going to do these other things.
So what would you change?
Oh, boy. I think there's first off, it's very hard for me to read it. I looked at it for so long in such detail. When I pick it up now, I get kind of scared of it because I read every line for so many days and days. I think that I wish that we had better data on the high end. So I think the one thing that we're, as a citizen, so again, I don't work for the FCC anymore, but as a citizen, and someone who cares a lot about the tech industry, it's where I've spent my career. I worry that as a country, the high-end services that we want and aspire to, we don't necessarily see taking root here yet. And you see some other countries being a little more aggressive on that. That said, we didn't really have good data on what the actual demand was for that. So, I think if we had better data about that, that's a part of the plan. Looking back, if there had been a way to spend more time on it and have a better set of answers around that, I think that would be great. I'm actually pretty encouraged by what's occurring in the market on that. And I'm not again, I'm much more into the applications than the speed. So I'm sort of the school of thought that speed is great, but what really matters is how we use it. But when I look at the Google, Googling hiring Milo, those of you that know Milo, he's probably the best network engineer the country's ever produced. Somebody like him going to Google with their cash resources and exploring a very high-end business, even to a small number of communities, that's a really good thing. And we need to kind of watch that. And I think there's, if you see more of that type of activity, that's a good thing. But that's probably one area where if I had more time, I'd, spend more time on it.
Let's make sure to get others into the discussion. Clyde, what's your reaction to the plan, and particularly the discussion about the applications and the inclusion part of the plan?
I would say for One Economy, for us, we're extremely excited about the plan. One Economy's been around for 10 years, and for us, the plan pretty much culminates the work we've been trying to do in regards to bringing access. Of course, access is important, especially for our low-income audience, but it's access and it's also adoption. So the plan basically spells out how it encourages adoption in communities. I think the points that were made here is access is one part. For the work I do here locally in DC, there are communities that are right down the street from us where Carrie, we were talking briefly about the broadband map that's being done here in the city, where you have communities that are in wards 7 and 8, where your penetration rate is at about 40%. Well, I'll say it's even, in some places, even worse. There's communities not too far from where I live at in Ward 7 where your penetration is at 12%. So for us, this is a joyous time for One Economy, actually. We are hard at work, and as the broadband adoption partner with the federal government to actually launch networks and create broadband networks in 27,000 units of housing across the country. But as we create those networks and bring that broadband, and we also believe in affordable broadband. So we're actually going to bring broadband to those units at free for 2 years. But again, it's the access is one thing, but it's the adoption. So as our families and especially our low-income users get a chance to get onto that broadband, they value it. And what we're hoping to see is once they value the broadband, we turn those residents into not free recipients, but eventually consumers, like all of us. Because I think that's also the important part. That's how you really get the adoption to go way past the 2 and 3 and 4 years.
Now, issues that have been identified as impeding adoption include cost, relevancy, and digital literacy. What's your sense of what needs the most focus?
I think it's kind of a multifaceted monster in many ways. Of course, it's access, especially in rural areas. It's a major problem. What we've tried to do is not only go that middle mile, but that last mile, or we call it the last few yards and feet into the home. Because you can have a community where there's access. I mean, here in DC, there's access abound. But the problem is, even if you get that affordability issue down, it's what's online for our residents, especially our low-income residents, where they not only deal with low computer literacy rates, but also low literacy rates as well. Mm-hmm. So they have to be able to see a broadband that's localized to them, see content that they can use to help improve their lives. So that's something that we've always pushed strongly, not only with the access, but also creation of web content and public purpose media.
Let's turn to Daniel Berninger. 5, 6, 7 years ago, VoIP was the hot new technology, and
it still is.
Still is. Tell us how it fares, how the plan intersects with applications like VoIP.
Right. So I'll hit on you mentioned the plan being timid. Some perceive it as timid, and so let me hit on that a little bit. So my background is basically an entrepreneur, trained at Bell Laboratories for 5 years, went and done about 6 companies. In between the companies, I serve as an analyst and do consulting. 2 of the companies you might have heard of, so Vonage is one of them, another company, ITXC. The others all failed, so you wouldn't hear about them. But so Vonage, as an example, is a company that was actually created for a broadband world before broadband existed. So we started that around 2000 and worked on the business model. There wasn't very much broadband out at the time, but we built the business model assuming that the broadband was going to be there. So as far as entrepreneurs and applications and startups, you absolutely need sort of a broadband world. Now, the problem with the plan, and so I don't want to disparage the plan, but it's my role. Everybody's loving the plan.
We need some critics here.
We need some
criticism. Go for it.
It's way too timid. The 100-100 goal, which is sort of the #1 goal, TechNet had that.
Just explain that. What is the 100?
Okay, so 100 megabits to 100 million people. TechNet came out with that in 2002, and they said, oh, we should be done with this by 2010. And so here we are, 2010, coming out with a plan that says, oh, well, this is our goal. See, in order to kind of really rally everyone around a plan like this, it really needs to have sort of a visionary goal. So leading up to the plan, we said, well, we're feeling really bad about the fact that we're number 18 or 17 or whatever is in connectivity around the world, and we've come in with a plan that's not going to change that. Maybe we'll stay the same, maybe we'll go down a little bit, but we're not going to be #1. So my view of going into it, oh, let's be #1, and what will it take to get us there, and why is that important? So if you're going to send somebody to the moon, hey, this is a really easy to understand goal. This is going to keep us busy for 10 years. We're going to solve all the problems. We don't know how to solve them today, but we will over 10 years. Interstate highway system, oh, this is really great. So let's do 40,000 miles of highway. We don't know how we're going to do it, but let's run out with it. And so that goal is really important. Now, the other issue is that as a country, we've kind of dug ourselves into a significant hole that this broadband plan isn't going to get us out of. And it could, in theory, in the sense that broadband really is, the connectivity really will be the driving force for economic growth in the future. So 20 years from now, 25 years from now, the top economies of the world will, oh, by the way, we'll also have 1, 2, and 3, the best connectivity in the world. And so if we're not there, then we're not going to have the top economy. We're saying to ourselves, in 30 years, we're going to be, smaller economically than China. Why is that? Okay, they have 5 times the number of people that we do, but we have 30 years to figure out how to remain the world's largest economy, and let's make broadband and connectivity a centerpiece of that and solve whatever problems we need to get there. Now, lastly, the carriers, one of the issues with the plan is that it basically fits within a political box that was defined for the FCC. And you can see that in a couple areas. One is underserved. Everyone absolutely agrees on underserved. So it will be covered. I'm all for that. So let's do underserved. But underserved isn't going to get us to number one, solving that problem. We're big on spectrum in the plan, and there's sort of the most details on how to utilize spectrum to get broadband. But, again, he mentioned, I'm a propeller head. Well, it's always better for connectivity to have a wired connection no matter what. And it will always be better to have a fiber between me and you for us to have connectivity. So we need to also address wired. Spectrum is more politically, everyone agrees on it, so okay, this is the path we're going to go on. So, and again, and the goal itself. So lastly, in terms of reframing and why we need a more aggressive goal, I don't think it serves the carriers themselves to put these constraints on the plan. That the carriers' business model has always been, we are going to sort of control the supply of voice, we're going to control the supply of broadband, and the problem is that has not served them well recently. The companies today that are valued the highest are the ones that generate demand. When a carrier earns $1, that translates into $1 of enterprise value for that carrier. When Google earns $1, this is a demand generation business, $7. So if you live in California, your money is worth 7 times as much as living on the East Coast. Apple is a demand generation company. They don't sit there and try to control supply. They create iPhone 1, iPhone 2, iPhone 3, iPhone 4, $4. They make $1, it translates to $4 of enterprise value. AT&T makes $1, let's just give them $1 of enterprise value. A company that is all about controlling supply in a world where there's lots of holes in the bucket. There's just all kinds of ways to get, for people to find communications, is not valued very highly. And there's an opportunity for the carriers that are delivering broadband today to sort of transform their business models, create sort of the Moore's Law equivalent of connectivity, and say, today you have 10 megabits, in 18 months you'll have 100 megabits, and just keep going on and on. And for the adoption issue, this ties into the adoption too. So I can't understand why anyone bought a computer in 1989. So I did, of course, and I got like a laptop with a 386 processor, and I was really thrilled with it. I paid $3,600 for it. But move forward a decade or 2 decades, and boom, there is a lot more compelling reasons to buy computers and to adopt computers today than there was then. And so the game in broadband for adoption is, again, deliver more value, deliver higher capacity. The higher capacity addresses a much larger addressable market of services, and you grow the economy and save the world. That's it.
Keith, let me ask this question. 5 years from now, will the broadband stimulus funding of NTIA and RUS have had a more significant impact on our economy and our broadband infrastructure, or will the National Broadband Plan have had more of an impact on these subjects?
Excellent question. First, thanks for inviting me to come. I probably have a little unique perspective from some of our other audiences because I joined MCI in the early days when it was a good company, and we were driving the change for fiber and digital. And then I went overseas to New Zealand, as you mentioned, and we got to see all the change that happened in the United States over a 10, 15-year period in about a 2-year period. So I do want to spend a couple seconds on that. But the thing with this, your question was, I think there really needs to be 2 things, and I want to relate it back to the broadband plan. I think the broadband plan is an excellent tool for a couple reasons. One, it's controversial. It's getting people together to talk about it and look at it. I read the plan after getting through the first paragraph because what it said was, this is an ecosystem. And if you start to realize that telecommunication, video, and data has its own life cycles, and that all of the people are right where they stand and from where they see, it's a very different perspective. Because otherwise what happens is we become device-driven. We talk about telemedicine because of the iPhone, or we talk about this because of that. And really what it is an exchange of information and data and services. I think the critical elements is that the network needs to work, right? One of the lessons in New Zealand when we went and looked at those was the network just didn't work. 30% of all the telephone calls were blocked because they bought the wrong technology. There was no 800 service, there were no calling cards, they really didn't do internet, and this was in 1990. By putting in middle mile networks first, We basically connected all of the country together. We put in new switching technology. Then we offered new services that came over those. I see the most exciting thing I like about the plan is a lot of the middle mile networks are going to places in Middletown America and rural America to provide an alternative access to get out of town. Because for broadband to work, it needs to do that. I think the second part that's really exciting about it is it recognizes that there's a role to play for wireless. I would agree with my colleague here. If you forgot to be king for a day, there'd be 100 megabits to every house. They can do it. You don't have to invent anything. You just need to spend the money. There would be a dramatic transformation in America. But given that we don't have $300 billion and no one's willing to go out there to loan it to you and build it, then the next step is use wireless. And by reallocating the spectrum and looking at the different wireless perspectives, you can gather data. But they have a problem. They can't deliver all the services that people want. So it really gets down to backhaul. So some of that middle mile network stuff is going to be important. CLEX will kind of be important. It will come together. And that's when you'll start seeing a change. One of the lessons learned in New Zealand that we found out is that none of our board or investors or the government thought it would happen this way. But basically, when they went in, they expected the largest cities to change first because of concentration of people and power. It doesn't happen. What happens is the most rural areas and the smaller areas and small businesses adopt first. Consumers adopt second. And then large businesses and other groups come along with those. So what happened was in New Zealand, the South Island and Christchurch and those areas that was in economic ruins at that point, basically the small businesses and the large businesses broke up and they started to drive it. Then people started using it. It started to work for them, and then they adopted it. They actually started taking down the copper wires on the farms and put up a cell phone for them because the farmers actually liked that. And the difference for them in making the move was something that we would consider funny. That was their telephone number in the telephone book. So if you called them, it went up there, it went to a little site, and they called it, and they got it whether they were on the tractor or in the house. Their phone still picked it up. For them, the barrier was gone. And I think that's one of the problems in the United States is we have broken this up into so many pieces, it's really difficult to see the ecosystem or to appreciate how it goes end to end. So by having the plan and a roadmap for those, it's going to incentivize people to get there. It'll get the technologists to start to drive it. It'll get the people that want to use it more. And I think fundamentally what we're going to see and why it has a chance now is it's going to help start driving jobs. And when those things happen, then you'll have a big plan change.
Rob, go ahead.
Well, look, at the end of the day, there's three things that you've got to think about in a plan, and I think the FCC did a pretty good job. And it's speed of the network, it's ubiquity of the network, and it's adoption, and then it's apps. So, but just to the network part, it's those three things. And if that's a Venn diagram, then you sort of have to allocate kind of how much of your resources are going to put in each of those slices of the pie. And if you end up sort of saying that we're going to create kind of utopian networks, 1 gig to every home, then a lot of the pie, that speed pie slice is going to be real big, and the adoption ubiquity pies are not going to be that big. And I think the plan got that right on that. And I guess to the point that Daniel made about the OECD rankings. Look, the OECD rankings are, to me, one of the most misunderstood thing in the world. And by the way, I would argue that we've done more as anybody in Washington to highlight the OECD rankings. We don't criticize the OECD rankings, as some people say. They're an accurate reflection of one thing, and that's adoption. The OECD rankings, by and large, don't measure ubiquity. There's now some speed things there, but by and large, the reason we fall behind on the OECD rankings and why we're 17th is because of adoption. The reason why we're behind on adoption is one single factor, and that's computer ownership. If we had the same level of computer ownership as the top leading 5 countries in the OECD, our broadband rank would be 6. The same network, everything else, it is really about adoption, stupid, if you will. And that's why what One Economy is doing is so important. That's not to say that networks aren't important, but I think we just got to get our priorities right. At the end of the day, so I live in Bethesda, and I'm blessed. I thank the broadband gods every day that I have fiber to the home, Verizon Fios. But I don't pay for the 50. I pay for the 20. And I'm real happy. I don't have, and I could afford the 50. So if I'm not advocating for more right now, I just don't get why we're telling carriers that they should be deploying 1 gig networks when there's virtually no demand for 1 gig networks. Now, I get the whole notion of chicken or egg. We've written about chicken or egg. And to me, what public policy should be doing is always sort of nudging networks to be faster than where the market is, but not 10 times faster, just a little bit faster, and then keep that virtuous cycle going. And I think the plan got
Comment
that
on that?
exactly right.
I wanted to hear Jim's, 30 seconds.
So part of the issue is the ecosystem issue, that this idea that you are targeting numbers is wrong-headed to begin with, right? So the computer industry doesn't sit there and say, oh, we're going to get this fast a chip and be done with it. No, it's an ecosystem that has continuous improvement. And if we could get an ecosystem of continuous improvement on the broadband side, that's what will basically get us to where we need to go, not picking goals.
Jim, your reaction.
I fundamentally agree with Dan's earlier comments, which is not to say I disagree with what you just said, but I fundamentally agree with Dan's earlier comments about the plan establishing aspirational goals and making the case for them. As you'll recall from the U.S. Broadband Coalition, I repeatedly asked the group to focus on the question, what it'll take for us to be a great nation, and don't constrain that question at the front end by concerns about affordability. First, look at what we need, and then we'll figure out whether we can afford it and what priorities to establish. And so I think that if there's the main weakness in the plan from my perspective is that it could have gone further in making the aspirational case. At the same time, I think it's inappropriate. It doesn't work to call the plan timid. And the reason for that is, and I'd like help from anybody out here who's a weightlifter, because I don't know the terminology. But the image I have is that if you want to lift a very heavy barbell, snatching it from the ground all the way up is extremely difficult. But if you go part of the way up and then press it the rest of the way, it's easier. And I think that what this plan did, which is a little different from what we're talking about when we're talking about being aspirational, is to say we can't have a tin ear to where we are at the present time. We need a plan that's responsible, that will not demand that we make a $300 million investment today, because that's not going to happen. So given some reasonable amount of money that may be available to us, how do we use our resources most wisely? And if you read the plan about how it discusses issues like gigabit connectivity and the threat to competition if 2/3 of our nation does not have competing carriers offering high bandwidth, it says the critical factor here is how demand will evolve. And if you read the plan together with Chairman Janikowski's introduction of the plan, where he recognized the Google Gigabit initiative and other initiatives that were going on, and says, now it's up to us to provide living models that will push us that extra distance. So to me, the plan is not timid in the sense that it shied away from asking these important questions, but it made a number of choices. Now, I may agree or disagree with those choices in a fundamental sense, but I think that there is rationality in those choices, and they weren't timid choices.
Eric.
You know, I think one thing just to respond to, because we asked this question of ourselves kind of every day, which was the starting point of, you know, what's best for America and what's, you know, how do we do this in a way that has the most impact on the country? And I kind of want to knit together something Jim said and something Dan said, because I think it's important to look at the whole ecosystem when you answer that question. So if you answer what's best for America, it's actually not just the network. You know, so we could say it's best for America to have gig networks, and that's a fun thing to say, and I like to say it because I like fast networks. But at a economic level, it's not clear that if that were only true, whether that would be best for America. If that were true and a bunch of other things were true, like super awesome healthcare applications that could lower the cost of healthcare by 3 or 4%. You know, that would be really great for America, and you kind of build from that. And to return to one of Dan's comments, which I think is actually very, very prescient, that you know, the the ecosystem right now, the market assigns different values to different tasks in the ecosystem. And we have to ask ourselves, you know, if you're an investor, is the market being rational or irrational? And, you know, I actually think it's being pretty rational. It's rewarding companies that are creating applications that people use, whether those are Apple computers or Google or whatever. And it's not necessarily rewarding network providers in the same way. Now, those network providers pay handsome dividends, so their capital structure is a little bit different. But, you know, if the market is valuing the things that people use where the most value is created, I'm not sure that's bad. And I think over time, that kind of pushes the whole ecosystem in the appropriate direction. And when there is a case for higher speeds, you'd hope that the market would reward those as well. And I think that, you know, the comments that Chairman Janikowski made at the beginning, kind of pointing out Google, that's the nudge. You know, that's saying, hey, let's get out there and see what happens if we had those fast.
Well, no, that last point is key, because it starts to get at, I'm not clear, or it wasn't until that last point, Eric, where you and Jim stand on this 3: speed, ubiquity, and adoption, because Rob's made clear he thinks adoption needs more work of the 3, but what about the trade-offs with speed and ubiquity? Where do you stand on that, Jim, and how about you, Eric?
Well, as to ubiquity and adoption, you know,
and speed in there too.
And speed. First of all, I think it's a disgrace that a country that thinks of itself as great does not have availability with the resources behind it so that every American can have affordable access to a decent level of broadband. So I think that we absolutely have to have a part of our national policy that focuses on enhancing adoption. As far as the trade-offs on speed and ubiquity are concerned, again, I go back and say we are seeing such a rapid evolution of demand. Rob is right. He may not need 50 megabits today, but who of us thinks that in a 10-year period, which this plan covers, that 50 megabits per second will be adequate 2 years from now, let alone 4, 5, 6, 7, and 10 seems unthinkable with the way that bandwidth-rich applications are developing. And so I think at the upper end, the plan is modest in that sense. Now, where the trade-off is at any point in time, I think comes down to a question of our having a national issue with adoption, so to speak, a national issue with education. We don't know what we're missing. We don't appreciate what we can do with all that bandwidth capacity today, but I am confident that we will learn, and we'll learn it a lot faster than the people who view these issues more conservatively do. And so I think that we ought to start thinking about National Broadband Plan version 2 within the next couple of years and update where we think we have come and where we think the trajectories are going to take us, and do the process again. And I hope as well relative to where we are a couple of years from now as this one was done for this period.
I want to get Clyde in here. Did you want to add anything? Unless you wanted to add anything, Eric?
Yeah, I just want to add briefly, sorry, that as we think about, I know about the device issue versus adoption, I think they go kind of hand in hand. If you, especially for within our underserved areas, where in many cases, and I'll be very honest and very blunt, especially as I go through a lot of our communities, you'll find our underserved, they'll get technology. They may not have the iPhone or the best BlackBerry, but they have a cell phone that texts, and they text often. In some cases, that prepaid plans actually fits more of their wallet. The device is a one-time cost for many of our residents and our users. It's that ongoing internet cost that, in many cases, for them is a huge barrier, where it's the $50 a month, even $30 a month is the issue. So as we talk about the devices versus the adoption, we have to kind of bring them together and realize, in many cases, it's that ongoing cost that, if we're able to kind of bridge that gap, can really spark that adoption for our underserved communities.
Go ahead, Eric.
No, I think just a point on adoption. because I think it is a part of the plan that you could write more. You could write a whole plan just about adoption, and it's really, really important. I think one conclusion we came to, for better or for worse, and I'd love, if there's a different way through it, I'm all for it. To us, adoption is an intensely local issue. I'm from Chicago, and I know the city backwards and forwards, and I can tell you that what the mayor's office has done in certain communities has been the exact right thing for those communities. But what the broadband needs of a South Side community that's got a huge unemployment problem are very different than a West Side community where we don't have as many native English speakers. Okay, the issues are different. So you can't just kind of march right in with like the adoption machine and say, here's the answer, because it's really subtle. And when we looked at the work One Economy and others do, we actually think that's sort of the right model to do this, and I think the plan speaks to that. The one thing that I'll say, and since One Economy is here, I tell every One Economy person this: keep measuring, because one of the problems we have with adoption is we have all these great stories. So you can find a great story about pick your favorite community, but you can't find kind of treatment and control analytics. Like you can't find like really solid analytics where you can say $1 spent on adoption here yields X number of dollars of benefit here. And I think that one of the things that my hope will be a legacy of the BTOP and the BIP programs is those grants that went to adoption contain prescriptions for measurement. So that's something that if you had to do this again in a few years, and you had some of these programs up and running, we could really make a lot of progress on adoption because we'd have better data on what works in each particular community.
So just one more thing on adoption, just to amplify what Clyde was saying. So bottom line with adoption, I'm not comfortable decomposing the Venn diagram, speed, adoption, availability. The bottom line is value, right? So why does everyone have a cell phone? It's compelling value. Value incorporates the price and what it gives you. And so connectivity has to have the same value. So what can I do with it? How much does it cost? There's my value. And so the ecosystem has to drive value to the endpoints. And one of the things right now, the tension in the industry is that there are people adding value to connectivity. Netflix is adding value to the connectivity, and it's driving the carriers crazy. And they're saying, well, that's a little too much value, or something. I'm working on Vonage 2.0, and I know as soon as the carriers hear about Vonage 2.0, they're going to say, that's a little bit too much value too. And so the carriers need to get to the point where they say, value's good. Again, I think sort of like Intel. Intel doesn't try to figure out where the heck the value is going to come from. They're just, and they spend a lot of time evangelizing value creation, but the part about creating value is extremely risk intensive. There's lots and lots of failures for the few successes. The carriers could have a business model where, all we know is we're going to make it faster and cheaper every year, and we're going to sell more of it because it's going to have such tremendous value, and more people are going to be adopting it, and we're going to evangelize that, people should add value. But we're not there yet.
Just one.
Sure. If Rob's going to say something on what you just said, I'll turn to him first, though.
Well, a couple things. Look, I think it is a cop-out to say that these aren't choices. And I put applications separate because applications, to me, there's applications and there's networks. And applications and networks are in positive interactive cycles, and so you've got to do both. But within the network, there are these three choices. And at the end of the day, those are real choices that get made about societal allocation. You look at what Chattanooga did. They did this. The electric utility. They used some stimulus money, and I don't think it was DOC. I think it was actually DOE. Yeah, it was DOE.
Smart grid.
And at least part of what they used it for, and I could be wrong on this, but what they ended up doing, and I don't know the money trail, but what they ended up doing is going from a 100 megabit network to a 1 gig network. And I'm like, that is to me one of the, I'd put that at kind of the last priority. If I had to rank projects in the US and I'm the czar, that'd be number last, okay? Number one would be going to a low-income community and helping them adopt. Number two would be to go to some rural communities in Illinois that have nothing and helping them. And number last would be going from 100 meg to, you know, to a gig. So I just think that those are real choices we have to face. I just wanted to make a point, Eric, about your point on adoption and this, you know, look, I think every locality, they love saying this stuff all the time, and especially states, you know, we're different. Well, you know, yes, they are different and all, but, you know, I helped one of the consultants who was the lead consultant on the mayor's digital adoption plan, and I thought it was a good plan. But when I talk to them and then I talk to other communities, they all have the exact same problem. They have different problems, but they have a core of similar problems. How are we going to deal with devices? How are we going to deal with training? How are we going to deal with all of these problems? And that's where I think there's a federal role of enabling some sort of broad-scale technical assistance organization and charge them with coming up with these collective solutions that everybody who's trying to struggle with this problem at the local or regional or neighborhood level or community group level can tap into this resource, because they're all, you know, I agree there's different unique situations, but they're a set of common problems, and I don't think we can just rely on kind of 1,000 flowers blooming. We've got to provide some national fertilizer to make that easier.
We all know what fertilizer is made of. No. Before we open it to the audience, Keith, why don't you say what you have to say and be thinking about your questions.
Okay, just the last point I was going to make. We're talking about the consumer devices and the apps, and it always brings me back to the fax machine. It was a wonderful device that drove telecommunication, expanded all of the switching networks, and if you think about what happened when it died, it created actually email. And so as we look at it, as the devices and the applications start to get their useful life and they're adopted by people because of value, we now need more broadband access because we're now integrating video, voice, and data together. So if you have a really old machine and you don't have the access, you don't find value in it because you can't interact with it. Same as if you had an old PC that's only like 4 years old and you try to go to a website and look at it. It just doesn't, it's not interactive. So part of this, the plan, I thought, and I'll go back to what the plan was, has 3 real basic things that need to come together. It isn't just one. You need to have access where you live and where you work. It needs to work. I think the second part is you need to have a real reason to use it, and those are developed by the consumer devices and the applications we got, and the government has done a really good job in starting this conversation. Commercial companies will invest where it's commercially viable for them, and the government needs to fill in some of the gaps for the other ones and keep raising the bar, because that's what America needs.
What's the third? The access, the reason to use it, and
then the third one is that the commercial people will go and invest where there's economically viable for them, but the government needs to help out in those other areas, particularly in the rural and the underserved areas.
So some way to monetize the reason to use it, basically?
Well, I think if there's a reason that they want to use it, either for entertainment or for them to have a business or for them to communicate, those are the reasons that they use it. And that's why those little phones are so good. And I think as we get services delivered to them, whether it's healthcare or education, that's also another reason for people to use it.
Sure. Jim?
Your use of fax machine presents an interesting issue and illustrates the point that you're making in an interesting sort of way. The carriers initially resisted fax machines until they discovered that if they had a fax machine or an answering device, more calls would get completed and their revenues would go up.
All right, let's open up to questions.
Thank you, Drew. Good morning. My name is Todd Wiggins. I'm a local social media person who enjoys YouTube. It's one of my favorite hobbies is putting up clips on YouTube and using it to report on events like this. I have a local question that ties into a national question. So I'll start off with Clyde, who lives in Ward 7, which is where our current mayor, Vincent Gray, is from. I wanted to ask you a scenario. Let's say Michelle Obama comes to visit, I don't know, a facility and you probably can actually think of one that she would visit in Ward 7, and a homeless person walks up to her and pulls out his cell phone and takes a picture or a video, which is actually what happened in a homeless shelter called Miriam's Kitchen, which basically says that even if you are quote unquote homeless, you still at least have access to a cheap cell phone or DC public libraries where everyone gets a computer as long as they have a card. So are we above the rest of the country, or how do we compare to the rest of the country? And then tied into it, and this is a national question, what's the worst case scenario that's included in the summary by Chairman, is it Janikowski, as an executive summary as to how badly we're doing, I mean, in wherever it happens to be, whether it's Appalachia or where it's the outskirts of, you know, America, where we don't have access at all. So what does that executive summary say?
I'll say locally, I think here in DC we are, and as we compare to other major cities across the country, I'll say we're in the middle. I mean, I'll be very blunt and honest. I just came from Seattle, Washington, where when you talk about access and just the connection between the city and the community in regards to, and the underserved communities in regards to underserved and access, they kind of blow us away in many cases. I mean, I'll give you a quick example. One of their thoughts is, I mean, of course, there's the issue of language barriers. Just initially in the city alone, all of their web content that's sponsored from the city is translated in 8 languages. And it accounts for the 8 immigrant groups in that city. So I think DC is a good start, but we have to progress forward.
Well, we have the chairman of the DC Public Service Commission here who's about to ask a question.
Well, I kind of, first of all, wanted to, Betty Ann Kane, chairman of the DC Public Service Commission, and we did cooperate with our Office of Chief Technology Officer in the district's broadband adoption plan, because, as Clyde said, it's available everywhere except for maybe a couple of places down the middle of Rock Creek Park where there's some mansions. But everybody's got a choice of 3 or 4 probably ways to have broadband. But specifically answer your question, the map that DC did using their BTOP money is more discrete and more data rich than the NTIA maps, because we went beyond that, focusing on adoption. It's on the web. It's broadband.dc.gov. Is that right, Carrie? I think dcbroadbandmap.dc.gov. You can look to it through the octo.dc.gov too, and it is by census tract, and it is on adoption, actual subscribership rates from every carrier and provider that we could find. And there are places, west of the park, where it's 100%, literally 80, 90, 100% adoption in some census tracts, and then east of the river, many places that are well below 40%. And you can just track it, and they overlay it with the demographics, with the census data, age, race, income, just sort of what you would expect. And it leads to the question I was going to ask, though. Everybody's talking about the need for data and the progress in adoption. And the thing that was going on parallel over the last year and was just published, of course, was the NTIA broadband mapping as to where it's available and to some extent where it's where there is subscribership. And there's going to be updates of that semi-annually over the next few years. Is that going to be a useful tool to see and measure how some of the goals of the National Broadband Plan are actually being carried out? Or is this a totally kind of separate, simply parallel exercise?
This may be a good question for Drew to answer.
Well, thank you, Jim. I actually did have some thoughts on that. As you know, Betty Ann, I'm very happy to hear that you've included all of this adoption data in your broadband map. I mean, less than a month ago, the NTIA did release the National Broadband Map, which has been a long time coming and a very dramatic achievement. But what Betty Ann has just pointed out is that there's more points of information, particularly about adoption, particularly about demand and usage, that need to be included. And that's exactly what the Partnership for Connected Illinois is doing, is taking the broadband data and including other aspects of data. And data never is just for itself. It's always to drive these 2 variables we've been talking a little bit about: access, how do you reach those hard-to-reach places in the state and in the country, and usage. And I think that really also blends back into the national purposes and the state purposes, which we haven't heard much discussion about, which is how do we then take this data? We've got a gold mine, finally, Eric. So how are we going to use this? What do you think the FCC and the NTIA should be doing with this data?
I think I want to try and answer that and also finish the second part of your question. The data is really valuable. There's no question about it. And I think that the more granular view we have, the better, particularly when it comes to some of the questions around the actual physical infrastructure and where isn't and where isn't it. Okay? So as a policymaker, the more you can get a higher resolution view of that, you can then take actions that you can be more confident in. So I think that data completely helps the FCC do their work. It helps the NTIA do their work, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things you find in that data, and we found this in the model that we did, and it's borne out in the NTIA map, and it kind of relates to your question, is that lack of availability occurs everywhere. You know, there's no, like, because we asked ourselves this question, like, is this just that there's like 3 parts of the country where we don't have this and we just have to go fix it? Not so much. It doesn't work that way. The chairman often talks about some places he's been. So if you read his speeches, he'll talk about West Virginia. He spent some time in Arkansas and different places where, and South Carolina. You know, so those are the things that come out in speeches. But I think if you look at the fact of the matter, which again is more borne out in the map at a more granular level of detail, there's a community just about everywhere that doesn't have access. It's small. And it's you know, and it tends to be in out-of-the-way places. I'll use the example where I'm from, which is Michigan, which is where I grew up. If you're in the southern part of the state down by Detroit, you know, there's plenty of infrastructure if you're close to Chicago. When you get to northern Michigan and you get up into the Upper Peninsula, there's not a lot of access. But what's important to remember about those parts of the world is it's not just about access. There's a whole lot of problems in some of those places. And in fact, northern Michigan really lost its industrial base because we don't really mine up there anymore. That's as big of a problem in the northern part of Michigan as the lack of telecommunications infrastructure. So I think when you look at the map, what you find is that we don't have infrastructure in certain parts of the country that we should care about for lots of reasons, not just telecommunications. And that sometimes these are places that for whatever reason, and again in the Midwest we have a lot of these places these days where the manufacturing base has moved. And there are still people there, some of which I'm related to, and we need to kind of, you know, pay attention to that. What are we going to do about that as a country? Is that a good thing or bad thing? How do we treat that? But I don't want to lose sight that in some cases telecommunications is only one part of what those communities face.
Let's get a couple more questions here. We have time for about 2 or 3 more.
Just amplify a little bit in that, I mean, in the previous, you know, century, it did matter where you lived, whether you lived near a mine, where you lived by a Ford plant. If you have super broadband connectivity, you have an opportunity to make a living no matter where you are, whether you're in Ghana or Upper Peninsula, Michigan.
I think that was going to be my next question to you, is how many of you actually don't have broadband in your home? Anybody? Because I work for a rural carrier. My name is Alyssa Clemson. We're a broadband over power line provider in rural America, and I'm here to tell you I just spent a week in Orlando at the Tech Advantage conference that NRECA puts on. There were probably 300 to 400 co-ops there, and I repeatedly have co-ops coming to me and saying, when are we going to get this? How do we get this? I've got, you know, 3 to 5 homes per mile. I've got 5 to 8 homes per mile. You know, how do we get this? When are you guys ready? When is that broadband regulation from RUS going to be out? And I guess I think it really links back to the fact that rural America is losing its people. And they are losing people and they are losing businesses because they have no communication to the outside world. How do you sustain a business in a community with no broadband? I'm chuckling here and I'm feeling your pain on adoption. But man, if I had $1 for every time someone said adoption today, I could probably provide rural America with broadband.
Let me actually turn that one to Keith. And New Zealand, you said it was the rural areas that got broadband first. How did that happen?
Well, I think we built out basically the networks to the major centers, but what we ended up doing as the competitor coming in, we focused on the rural areas to go put it out there because for exact reason, they don't have anything. And they are the first ones that are trying to conquer distance and the capabilities. And as soon as we put it in place, the jobs came. Because what ended up happening is the farmers basically had computers and they were trying to track market and shares to do their real business. They needed to have communications with the universities. I would say I find that same thing when I go back to rural America where we're looking at and helping. It's absolutely critical because they need the infrastructure there to be able to get the services and would use it and would adopt it. On the other side, I understand the other issues. On a bigger picture, we need to get more people to kind of use it, but you need to target those areas specifically to give them access that works. One of the funniest stories that I told them when I was doing West Virginia First was that I used to have to drive into Bluefield and Beckley to have my meetings. I got on a DSL line, and I could not connect to my computer to get my email. So I would have to drive all the way to Covington on the border of West Virginia to Virginia to go to the Holiday Inn Express, hook up my PC there so I could get my email, and then drive back to hit my meetings. And when we were with the infrastructure providers at the meeting, they were telling me I had the wrong computer. and the wrong cell phone because it didn't work. And I was like, look, this is the problem you solve that you face in rural America. I have the right equipment. You don't have the right service. So demand is driven by those three things: giving them the access that works, giving them enough speed so that it's interactive and useful to them, right? And then the third part is that I can afford it, because it doesn't help to have it all there in rural America if it's going to cost me more than what you can be there. And that's the trick that the government's trying to play, is balance those things out so that it works for all of us.
Great. Next question.
Hi, Kelly Bowen Conterra. I may be the other vendor here. We provide broadband in rural America, either by wireless or hybrid networks. And the couple of quick points I was going to make. One, government action can lead to things. My first job out of grad school was to go to Sweden and explain divestiture, Swedish Telecom, which was fascinating. But one of the things I learned was that one of the reasons we have a cellular industry is because the Swedish government mandated that every citizen that had a permanent home had a right to a phone line. Well, that worked great until you realize that includes a lot of Lapps in Lapland and a lot of people that live in the Stockholm archipelago, and the cost of running pole lines out there was going to be breathtaking. That provided just enough incentive for Ericsson and Motorola to develop the Nordic mobile telephone system, which was the first commercial cellular network in the world that actually worked. So the unintended consequences of government actions can sometimes be good. The second thing is, I deal in rural America and in unserved, underserved, unservable, and exurban areas, along with Mary and I have met each other in some fascinating places for meetings about trying to help out some of her would-be Russ clients get their stuff backhauled out. And the two things that I would bring out is the plan, for reasons probably obvious, didn't get into sustainability anywhere near enough on all of these networks. And secondly, when I was at all those BTOP and BIP pre-meetings 2 years ago, nobody that controlled dirt was at any of those meetings. No BLM, no National Forest Service, no Park Service, nobody that controls right-of-way was there. And without rights-of-way and subsidy for sustainability, you do not have rural deployment in this country.
So what's the take-home message of what you've said that we could get our panelists to weigh in on?
Well, the obvious question is, where do we find sustainability in these networks? Because I do E-rate, E-rate's price sensitive.
About sustainability, I mean, once the wires are up, or once this infrastructure's up, the cost of maintaining it is the same everywhere, right? So it's the same equipment that. So you're gonna.
When you drop down to anything below an 8 home per mile, you're talking about a completely different cost. Mm-hmm. And then you're talking about getting your big ILECs to even bring in a middle mile.
So then you basically switch over to a moral issue, what Jim hit on early on. If we want, as a #1 priority, to be the #1 connected country in the world, then morally we want all of our citizens connected. We're going to have to do it no matter what.
That's right.
And we haven't quite reached that yet.
As Herb Dordick once said at USC back when I was a grad student, is or is not communications a societal good? If it is, then it's subsidized, then it could be subsidized. If it's not, then there will be people out there who do not get communications.
Well, and that's back to our swimming pool argument. We only have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Dan Pertuna with ICF. We've been flirting around this concept of adoption and sustainability, and I think you've heard it now from both sides, but in today's sort of resource-constrained environment from a federal perspective, we talked about the broadband plan, and I think you can say that it's brought a lot of good. I think we've had sort of consensus that there's a lot of good in the plan. There's also some things that could be changed. But from the standpoint of adoption and getting federal policy changed in other areas to drive need and to generate demand, we've had some examples about Google and some from a commercial perspective. But what do you see as the government's biggest next role or dealing with federal policy? What policies could we change or could be changed outside of maybe the FCC or maybe internal to the FCC as well? But where do we see policy change necessary from a federal standpoint to generate some of that demand that may then drive some of the technology adoption, some of the application development, and really provide carriers the incentive to continue to invest and continue to build out networks?
I think you're starting to see that in a couple places. You know, at the FCC, the two biggest things on the agenda this year are Spectrum and Universal Service, which I think go right to the issues that we're talking about. Those are really complicated problems, and I wish them the very, very best on them. The friends that I still have back there have a hard job, and we all need to be patient with them. Let them do their work. These are hard problems to solve. But I think as a matter of policy, those to me are those are the two big ones. And fortunately, the NPRMs are starting to come out and the debates are starting, and that's what needs to happen. I think when you look across the government, there already have been some interesting things. When I look at national purposes, and we'll hear more about this tomorrow, I think some of the areas where we want better applications, there are cases for some small changes in government, and I'll use education as an example. To me, the most interesting thing that's happened in the last year is how quickly the iPad, iPhone, Droid platform things have evolved and competed. Because you now have a way to distribute software to, 50 million devices without too much expense. And that software and content or whatever. And you also now have two new publishing models from Google and Apple that are going to let people create content, distribute that content, and finance that content at a much lower cost than we have today. If you were the Department of Education and you saw these things happening, you might start thinking about how do you incent schools in terms of allowing them to purchase that digital content, et cetera, et cetera. And I know there's a good tech ed plan that they've done, and I think that I can't speak for the Department of Education, but the things I read coming from there are consistent with this notion that there is some shifts in how we finance and distribute content that are occurring in the market that may bring great benefits to our schools. And I think as you go through all the different parts of national purpose, you can see that. I know the executive branch, and I think the White House in particular, led some efforts on healthcare standards so that we could email health records back and forth, which was an example of industry and government coming together very quickly, getting a standard organized. Things like that. That's going to unlock the application market. And then once that's a standard, then someone will invest in a nifty way to share health records. That's not going to be nobody at the government's going to decide that, but capital will come into the market.
This is the perfect question for anyone to offer final thoughts on. I see Jim and Rob both wanting to weigh in. Go ahead.
I'm on mission again. I'm grateful for all of the dialogue on the National Broadband Plan, but I think that one of the things that we need to do is to pull back from our broadband-centric view and look at the problems that it can contribute to solving. In particular, to me, my passion is economic development. And I think that all too often, economic development is an answer to the question of what you can do with broadband, and I think it ought to be turned around. We have a huge challenge in our country to rethink our workforce, what kinds of jobs will be sustaining and fulfilling in the long term. We've got dying communities for a variety of reasons. We have people who are not taking full advantage of opportunities they have. I think we as a country need to come to grips with how we do economic development better. What is it? What kinds of flavors of economic development are there? Some that are very profitable, some that create jobs. And I think we need to attack the issue of job creation, economic development in a sensible sort of way, the way you at ITIF approach issues of that kind. We need to explore the role of innovation and all of that and view broadband as being an essential platform and component of the solution to that problem, but we've got to go after that problem. The National Broadband Plan spent about 10 pages on economic development at the back of the plan. I think that those are valuable 10 pages, but we need a lot more pages in our national dialogue on economic development.
A couple of things. One is I think that the plan did a very good job on laying out, I think, two of the biggest things that the FCC can do next, and one is spectrum. And I really think we underestimate the power of 4G and LTE in particular as providing pretty good and good enough access, at least in the short run, for a lot of people. If you can get 10 megs out in a rural area on LTE for your fixed broadband or for a device, that's pretty good. And, you know, differ a little bit with Eric. I don't think they're complicated substantively. I think they're complicated politically. And it is pretty clear what we need to do with spectrum. We just need to take it from the broadcasters and give it to, and auction it off for real effective use. I mean, that's clear. Now, politically, that's the challenge, but substantively, that's not the challenge. We need to repack all the channels into what they should be and then free up all the rest. And with USF, I think it's also very clear. The chairman gave, I think, a very compelling address, actually, at ITIF recently, where he laid out a USF reform plan, and I think he was absolutely right. And you know, we just need to summon the political will to do that. One last point on the adoption thing. We did an event on last Thursday where we had a panel on mobile business models, and there was a guy there from USC, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name, but he was the head of a program at USC that comes up with and develops applications for mobile business. And one of the applications they've developed, it is so unbelievably cool. It's a Yelp application for people with disabilities. So a person with disabilities would be able to sort of crowdsource this notion that, you know, hey, Clyde is a good place, but it doesn't have ramp access, or, you know, all of these kinds of things that, if you're disabled, are really important for you to be able to walk around a city and know where to do it.
They do have an elevator.
Okay, good. So we're good. But the point is that if you're disabled, this supposedly is a big deal, that it matters, and no one's developed an application like that. And this group is developing this application. They're developing educational apps. As I recall, they don't get any government money, or at least they get very, very little government money. It seems to me that we should be funding a bunch of centers like that. And this USC center, to me, is an exemplary thing that's working on developing these applications that are niche applications. They're not big enough for the big market to develop, but they're really, really important for a certain group of people. And I think if the government were to be putting in, you know, $5 million a year, even a little bit of amount to seed some of this app development, both on the mobile and the on the wired side, we'd go a long way.
Any final words?
Last one for
I just go do on priorities. That right now the broadband plan as it stands reflects the national priority in terms of where broadband stands relative to other things. I think we could do a lot more as an industry to make the case, you know, sort of what Jim was saying, that broadband actually offers a lot more in a lot more categories. Right now, like the budget, so rather than not necessarily spending more money, but reallocating money, and I think you get a lot bigger bang for your buck. Right now the budget is sort of energy driven. So we said, you know, we spend $80 billion on the roads, we spend $1 trillion to build them, and now, you know, $80 billion to incrementally work on them. Our defense spending is awfully energy driven. You know, why are we in these various places? Oh, energy security. And so I think we can do a lot better job sort of raising connectivity up in the sort of in the priorities of the country.
I guess just the last piece, that the part of the plan, and it comes back to the map in place, that although the maps weren't funded by the plan, I think they're really critical. If you think about this being a change that you want to happen, is we need to measure what's actually there and where we want to try to get to. The problem with the plan, the mapping, as I think it'll come out for all these, is it's probably okay for within a city, but if you live just outside the city of the other ones, the granularity of its accuracy is questionable, no matter who you are. And so I think that if there could be a bigger emphasis on actually collecting the real data, measuring it effectively, we could reallocate these other dollars with a little less risk and get more bang for our buck. And if we had one thing on the Christmas list we could ask for, it's having some real data to make the decisions with.
Well, we certainly believe in that at Partnership for Connected Illinois. Eric?
I would just like to say thank you for reading and debating the plan.
Well, wonderful. We will, to conclude us, Sylvia, will you remind our audience about the next event?
Sure. We have a couple of events coming up that might be of interest to you. On Tuesday, April 19th, we'll have better broadband adoption. What levers will improve take rates nationwide? And on Tuesday, May 17th, we'll have Actually, I think this might be a IP Breakfast Club, but the International Hacking and Cybersecurity is the internet secure enough? And I wanted today to thank our sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, Telecommunications Industry Association, and U.S. Telecom. Thanks, and please give a hand to our sponsors and to our moderator, Drew Clark. I want to thank again our panelists.